And welcome, and thank you for coming out on this strangest of Sunday nights. My name is Chloe. Tonight's show is the Reliquary of Dreams, and I'll tell you all about that in a moment. But out of respect, we're going to start this evening with just a minute's silence, and if you wish to, in that minute, you can reflect on the life of the late Queen. Thank you very, very much. In Stroud, of course, these are obligatory. The Reliquary of Dreams. I was told nobody could say it, let alone spell it. A box of treasures, a box of sacred items, memories, stories, all the things that I hold precious. Tonight is a feast of my favorite stories. It's got nothing to do with you. This is all about pleasing me tonight. Well, of course it isn't. I've done this 21 years. I should know better by now. For those of you who've never experienced Story Cabaret before, this is not scripted. This is what I call verbal jazz, hot off the tongue. I don't give myself the stress of learning anything by heart. So in the next 50-odd minutes, almost anything can happen. And I want to do quite a different set from yesterday. But I'm going to start with a little feel-good story. It is a folk tale. And as we go through tonight, I will describe a little bit how I work, because I don't just do folktales and legends and traditional stories. I can have enough of the traditional stuff. But I'm going to start with a story from just up the road from the city of Worcester. It was about this time of year, and the scrap merchant of Worcester had been busy driving around the city with his old pony and cart, collecting the stuff that people no longer wanted. He got old chairs and pots and pans, but of course what Worcester was famous for was porcelain. And what he got most of was piles and boxes and buckets full of broken crockery. Oh, the colours, the designs, such exquisite, rich colourings and glints of gold. And he took all of it home, and at home he had a daughter with an amazing talent. She could mend a lot of things. And what she couldn't mend, she could remake into something completely different. It was a very early form of recycling and upcycling. And then her dad would take what she'd made and flog it for very good money at Worcester Market. In particular, she had a talent with the broken porcelain. And it was a warm autumn morning. And this young woman, who was blossoming into the glory of her young beauty, she was sitting at the table in the dingy back kitchen with a pile of broken pottery, porcelain pieces. I'll get the words in the right order soon. And a big pot of glue. And because she'd done this work for so many years, she wasn't really thinking about what she was making. She was picking and pasting and sticking and dreaming of love, because she was hardly ever allowed out. Her dad didn't want her going out, didn't want her making friends, didn't want her getting noticed by any likely lads. He wanted her stopping at home, making money for him. Picking and pasting and sticking and dreaming of love for about 3 hours. And then she stopped and looked at what she'd made. And the pieces she'd been working with were not your average Worcester porcelain colours. This was more like Delft. It was blue, it was white, it had flecks of gold, and she looked and saw that what she had made was a life-size porcelain man. Oh yeah, you're ahead of me. He looked as if he could be fully functional, correct in every anatomical detail. And as she gazed at what she had made, porcelain blue eyes opened. There was a gold-edged mouth that smiled and opened, and the porcelain man spoke. "My sweetheart, my love, at last you have found me. Come to my arms." Well, the young woman didn't need telling twice. She stepped into the porcelain man's embrace, and with just a very slight cracking, chinking sound, his arms closed around her, and for the first time in her life, she got kissed. And she liked it. She liked it a lot. She put her back into it, and he was getting into his stride, and she was sitting up on the kitchen table, and her skirts were riding up higher. It was at that moment that the kitchen door opened, and there was her dad standing in the doorway. He took one look, he took one step. With his big, heavy fist, he smashed the porcelain man down, breaking it into hundreds of pieces, flying across the kitchen. And then he turned again and slapped his daughter down to the floor, turned, slammed out of the room, and turned the key in the kitchen door lock. The girl lay still and silent. She knew better than to get her father's attention back to her after he'd lost his temper. But as his footsteps faded, she picked herself up, went to the sink and bathed cold water on the bruise, and looked around. There were porcelain pieces glinting all across the kitchen floor. And then on one of them, a porcelain blue eye winked at her. And there was the gold-edged mouth that opened again. "My sweetheart, my love, fear nothing. My magic is strong. Now, let me take you away from everything you have ever known. Get your glue, stick me together again in the shape of a horse, get on my back, and we shall leave." Well, she didn't need telling twice, and she picked and she pasted and she stuck faster than she'd ever worked in her life. But so many pieces had been crushed to dust, she only had enough left to make about a 12-2 hand pony. She got on its back and nudged its sides with her heels. It walked astride. It trotted astride. It had the most gorgeous flowing mane and tail with gold glints and little blue and white delicate porcelain hooves. It trotted astride, it cantered astride, and it jumped clean out through the kitchen window and landed skidding on the cobbles outside. The girl hung on to its neck, and the little pony bolted with her on its back down the street. People shouted, children screamed and chased after it in great excitement, but nobody could catch the blue and white and gold porcelain pony. It galloped right through the streets, through Worcester Market, down the hill and around the cathedral and over the bridge and out into the country lanes. Yes, I know Worcester. And those of you who, like me, have ridden bolting horses, you know you just sit there and pray you don't fall, and you don't touch the reins, and you don't try to steer it because that will make it buck, and you just sit there, and then eventually the wretched creature slows down and you can sit up and catch your breath. The porcelain pony was well out into the country lanes when it did slow and came to a stop just before a sharp turn in the lane where there was a big old oak tree on the corner. And when the pony stopped and the girl sat up, the pony turned its head on its neck to look back at her, and again there was that very slight cracking, chinking sound. And the pony said, "Now, my love, I need you to be braver than you've ever been in your life. I need you to ride me full speed into the trunk of that tree and smash me to pieces again. Well, the girl was used to doing as she was told. She nudged the pony into a trot, a canter, a headlong gallop, and crash, smash, shatter. She, as I have done many a time, she threw herself off and rolled and picked herself up. Very skillful. And then there were pieces of porcelain all along the verge, and just half a gold-edged mouth, which said, "Now, pick me up, gather me together, put me back together in the shape of a man, and you and I can be together and love each other forever." Which is when the young woman burst into tears. She'd forgotten to bring the glue. She sat there at the edge of the road, sobbing as if her little heart would break. And I have to tell you, she was one of those very pretty young women who can sob without red eye. No snot, just gentle, genteel sobbing. And as she sat there, thubbity thud, thubbity thud, there came the sound of a real horse's hooves coming up the lane towards her. She looked, and there was a big brown real horse being ridden by a very attractive real young man with one of those white romantic shirts, you know, with the big sleeves. And he had a clean face and nice hair and very tight breeches. And the best thing about him was the kindness of his face. As he rode past her, he reined his horse to a halt, and he said, "Madam, I can see that you're in trouble. What can I do to help you?" And she looked up at him and she said, "I was running away to be with my true love. It's broken. I'm going to glue." The young man was a bit nonplussed. He said, "You need glue." "Yes." "Well, if you will come back to my father's manor house with me, the servants will bring you as much glue as you need." "Oh, thank you." And the squire's son jumped down and helped the girl gather all the porcelain pieces into his saddlebag, which he put back on his horse, and then he scooped her up in his arms, which was quite athletic of him, as she had plenty of curves, and he put her on the horse and then extra athletically vaulted up behind her. I love to see a young man do that. And then, of course, he had to reach around her to pick up the reins. And where the porcelain man had been cold and unyielding, the squire's son was warm. There were muscles moving under that romantic shirt, and he had that scent of clean, healthy, young man. I can just about remember it. As they rode away together down the lane, the young woman was thinking a lot. They got to the manor house. The squire's son was as good as his word. The servants brought glue. The two young people sat at the kitchen table opposite each other, and there was the pile of porcelain pieces. There was the pot of glue, and together they worked, talking to each other, gazing into each other's eyes, picking and pasting and sticking and reaching out for more pieces, and their fingertips touched. After about 3 hours, they stopped to look at what they'd made, and what they had made together was a very handsome, a splendid blue and white with glints of gold porcelain tea service. Cups and saucers and delicate little plates, and on one of the cups, porcelain blue eyes opened and blinked dolefully. On the saucer, there was the gold-edged mouth that now turned down, and opened and spoke. "My sweet, my love, I thought you and I were going to be together forever. Have you forgotten me so soon?" And that magic must have startled the young woman, because she jumped to her feet with a gesture of wild astonishment, and of course it was a total accident that her gesture knocked that particular cup and saucer flying off the end of the table. And I'm sure she meant to jump forward and save that cup and saucer. It must have been an absolute total accident that her great big hobnail boot ground that cup and saucer into irreparable dust. In the first days of winter, there was a gorgeous wedding. Everyone was invited, even the grumpy old dad, and the fires were lit and the feasting was wonderful. But you know what it's like after you've been to a good party and you've drunk and you've eaten and you've drunk and you've drunk. What do you want at the end of it all? You want a nice cup of tea. And tea was served, of course, in Granny's green, pink and white Worcester porcelain service. The gold, white and blue set, on the orders of the squire's son, had been stacked by the servants on trays, and those servants had carried those trays up to the furthest, topmost attic of the manor house and locked the whole lot in a cupboard, never to see the light of day again. Thank you. And I will credit the wonderful storyteller Cat Wetherill for the origins and inspiration of that story. Then I did more research and found that the story probably originally, centuries ago, came from China. Porcelain, China. Yes, and travelled along the Silk Road and back again, and so many of these stories have been literally around the world. It is hard to know their true provenance. Since we've got into a little romance, I'd like to tell you a story I don't often get a chance to do. If I sit down, can you still see me? Yeah. All right. In the Western Isles of Scotland, on the Isle of Barra, around the shores, there grows an unusual kind of seaweed. This seaweed is long-stranded and grey-green, curling with a wavy, yellow golden edge to it. It is called Fair Maiden's Tresses, and there's a story to that. A friend of mine told me that the waters around Barra are so clear green, you can see right down to the ocean floor and count the arms on the starfish. There were once two sisters who lived on Barra. Two sisters who shared a croft and shared the hard work of their lives. One sister was fair, the most magnificent mane of shining, curly, golden hair like sunlight in motion. The other sister was dark, great curtains of near black curls that lit up sunset red towards the end of the day in that sunset light. She was as dark in her hair and as dark in her manner as the night, as dark as a secret never told. There weren't a lot of available young men in the islands. As luck would have it, both sisters fell in love with the same young man. And young men sometimes being what they are, this one either couldn't or wouldn't decide which of the sisters he would marry. Dark was desperately in love with him. Dark would do anything to win him. Dark went to ask for help from the wise woman of the islands, and the trouble with asking for that kind of help is that sometimes you get it. Be careful what you wish for. The wise woman taught Dark a song. And you are very lucky, ladies and gentlemen, that I don't sing in public. This is the kind of song that wraps itself around you, that holds you in place and makes you dream. Dark learned the song well. A couple of days later, she and Fair were out gathering driftwood on the foreshore. It was one of the few places on that treeless island where they could get enough fuel for their fire. Yes, there was peat, but they also collected huge bundles of driftwood, and they'd done so that day, and they were making their way back towards the path up to the top of the cliffs. Big bundles of driftwood on their backs and a lot of rocks to clamber over, rocks that were slippery and difficult, with barnacles, and the long-stranded curling seaweed, which was at that time a plain grey-green. The tide was on the turn, the sun was setting, the light of it lit up in Dark's hair. As they made their way carefully across the rocks, Fair stopped and said, "I am so tired. Look, there's a bare patch in the middle of the seaweed. Let's just rest a while and watch the sun set." And so both sisters sat down next to each other, their bundles beside them, and looked out to the horizon where the huge blood-red sun was sinking into the sea, sending out red ripples almost to the sisters' feet. And as they sat there, Dark began to sing the song she'd been taught. A chant, a melody, magical sounds that entwined around Fair, and that sister curled herself down on the rocks and went straight to sleep. Still singing, Dark picked up strands, shining golden strands of her sister's hair, and began to twine them into slithering ropes of seaweed that she picked up from just nearby. And together the hair and the seaweed was bound and wrapped and entwined, just like the song. And Dark looped seaweed over her sister's ankles, around her sister's legs, and across her body, and binding her arms, and more hair and seaweed twisted and wrapped and knotted around Fair's throat. And then Dark stopped singing and picked up her bundle and walked off the rocks and went up the path to the top of the cliffs, setting off towards her croft, when who should she see coming towards her, smiling with joy, but the young man of her heart's desire. As they met, Dark turned up her face to be kissed, but the young man said, "I have heard the most glorious singing. Some woman down on the shore. I must find her. I must know who she is. She must be exquisite." And he pushed past Dark and set off down to the beach. A moment later, he'd seen Fair out on the rocks, and she'd woken up, and she was calling. She was calling and struggling, and she cried out, she screamed to be set free. Dark heard her and turned, but did not move further. And then the young man was on his knees beside Fair, in among the seaweed, plunging his hands into the horrible twisted ropes of seaweed and golden tresses, ripping and wrenching and trying to set the young woman free. He could not. And he was still struggling, and Fair was still calling out as the incoming tide overwhelmed them both. Dark was standing at the top of the cliffs. Dark had watched it all happen, with her hair and her black cloak billowing around her. As the waves foamed at the bottom of the cliffs, the heads of 2 seals bobbed up in the waters, exactly above the place where her sister, Fair, and the young man had been. Magic had happened. The people had been turned into seals, and the seals swam around each other, touched noses. They were together forever. And Dark realized that she had killed and lost the 2 people she loved most in all the world, and her heart broke inside her. She took a step to the edge of the cliff and stepped off. As she plunged down, the darkness of her hair and her cloak and her dress changed. Her neck, her body elongated, and everything became black feathers. It was a cormorant that dived neatly into those waters and bobbed up a moment later, looking around, looking to see where the seals had swum to. And the cormorant tried to swim after the seals. It wanted to catch up with them. It wanted to touch them, to touch sorry to them. But the seals were so strong, dived so deep, swam so fast, the cormorant could not reach them. So the cormorant tried to call after them, wanted to call sorry after them, but all that would come out of its throat was a harsh croaking. And so on the Isle of Barra, the people say that is why there is this grey-green seaweed with the curling golden edges. That is why they call it Fair Maiden's Tresses. They say that is why there are seals and cormorants in those waters. And they say too, that is why the cormorant's cry is so harsh and sad. Thank you. Thank you. Goodness me, where does the time go? That's one of those stories that I've known for so long I can't even remember where I first heard it, at some festival or other. But the thing is, in the end, I want to help storytelling evolve for the 21st century. Yes, we need to conserve and preserve the traditional material. And where does storytelling go next? Because if we stay with the traditional stuff solely, it's going to become fossilized. So I experiment. I like experimenting on my audiences. There was a very modern young couple a handful of years ago, A man and a woman who met and fell in love and decided that before they got married they would live together. Very modern. They found a place to rent and they moved in, and among the woman's possessions that she brought with her was a little decorative box, about half the size of a shoebox, probably some illegal sandalwood inlaid with illegal ivory and mother of pearl, but it was very old, so... And she took this box and she put it on the mantelpiece and she turned to her man and she said, I want you to make me a promise. I want you to promise me that you will never, ever open this box. Well, he was in love, so he said yes. And they started their life together, and they were a very modern young couple, so they did lots of things together, but they still kept their own old groups of friends. So she would go out with the girls for wine and cinema, and she had a nasty habit of going to the opera. And he would go out for beer and football and comedy nights. And that was fine and good. And sometimes, now this is how modern this story is, sometimes when he was doing the vacuuming, he would go past the coffee table, past the mantelpiece, and he'd look at the box and his curiosity would wake up. And then he remembered, no, he'd made a promise. He would not open the box. And then one night she was out with the girls and he was at home with pizza and multiple cans of whatever he was drinking. And whatever he was drinking was quite strong. The pizza was dull and the video was even duller, and he was bored and on his own. Sitting on the sofa, and his gaze went to the box on the mantelpiece, and his curiosity itched at him. He couldn't resist. His curiosity picked him up by the scruff of the neck, marched him up to the mantelpiece. He picked up the box. No sound. He sat down, had another can of drink, and then he opened the box, and there was nothing in it. Not even dust. He was still sitting, grinning at the box when she came home, saw what had happened, and he looked at her and said, what was all the fuss about? There's nothing in that box. She said, oh yes, there was. Our trust was in that box, and you've broken it. And she went upstairs, packed and left, went home to her mother's. Ladies and gentlemen, don't let anybody tell you that big boys don't cry. The poor man was in pieces. He cried most of the night, but he had to go to work the next day. That's life. And he had to get on with his life. And although he tried to contact his ex-girlfriend, she wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he did get on with his life, and he met new women, and eventually he got together with a woman who was, well, possibly not as attractive and possibly not quite as clever as the first one. But you know that thing when you meet someone and there's that rapport. It's like after 10 minutes, it's like you've known them all your life. And when I last heard about that man and the second girlfriend, they are still together, very happily. And you are sitting there thinking, fine, nice, what happened to the first one? I'll tell you. Well, at the time, you still did these dating agency things. I mean, it used to cost about £300. And you filled in a form with your interests and your preferences. And then the dating agency fails to find you someone, or sends you on a 3-hour drive to Shrewsbury to meet a sheep farmer who wants independence for Wales. Yes, I'm speaking with the voice of bitter experience. I'm sure he was a very nice man, but when he started describing how he changed the number plate of his car registration to reflect the geographic area in which he lived, I decided it was time for me to make my excuses and depart. So she had several experiences like that, and she also met some very pleasant men. And then it was dating apps, and the similar problem in every case. Every man did something wrong as far as she was concerned. She never found anyone who came up to her standard. And when I last heard about her, she was still living with her mother. You have been warned. So, I'm going to give you a choice for the last story of the night. We can go for Japanese legend, which is slightly punk with a touch of horror. Or we can go for magnificent English folktale. Glorious magic and revenge. Let's have a round of applause for the Japanese bloody legend. Let's have a round of applause for the English glorious revenge story. Ooh. I think it's just the Japanese legend, I think. Yeah, I'll put the other one on my YouTube channel. Midnight Storytellers UK has a YouTube channel, and you'll find quite a lot of my material on there. It's my legacy project. And I don't think it's on my CD, but I do have CDs to flog to you tonight. So see me afterwards. I should have been a teacher. No, I shouldn't have been a teacher. I would have traumatized them. I once did a workshop in Coventry, and there were 200 year 8s in front of me. And they were messing about such that I stopped the session. I said, I am not here to waste your time, so don't waste mine. If you don't want these stories, I'm leaving. And I was prepared to forego my fee for the day. And there was this shocked silence descended on the group. And the little voice said, is she always this weird? And I looked at her and I said, darling, I haven't started yet. They decided they wanted the stories. Oh yeah. Anyway, that's beside the point. In the time when stories were being made, in the ancient days of Japan, it is told that there were 800 gods and goddesses and lesser deities. Among the most powerful was the sun goddess Amaterasu, golden and glorious, and even bossier than I am. Amaterasu lived in a shining palace high in the mountains of Japan, a palace of many rooms, of exquisite decor, beautiful flower arrangements, paper walls. There was a great hall of weaving, and in the great hall of weaving were 7 magical looms and 7 magical maidens weaving at those looms. Some people say that what they wove was nothing less than destiny itself. Amaterasu was the kind of goddess who had a place for everything, and everything had to be in its place. She did relax a little. She liked spending time with her pet pony. Now, you know how the Japanese love their creatures to be miniature. So she had a miniature Shetland pet pony. Tiny little thing, brown and white, piebald job. Slightly magical, sparkly mane and tail, great big brown eyes, snuffly velvety pink little nose, and sparkly golden hooves. I have to tell you, it does not end well for the pony. Amaterasu had a younger brother, Susanoo Mikoto, Susanoo Mikoto was the lord of oceans and storms and volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunami. He liked stirring up trouble. He liked winding up his older sister. And some of you will know, older sisters, younger brothers, sometimes that doesn't go so well. He wound her up. She nagged him. Stop doing that. Stop behaving properly. Behave like a proper young god should. He went on and on and on at him. There came a time when Susanoo Mikoto decided that despite everything, it was necessary for him to make the effort to behave correctly. He did so well that his older sister decided to take the risk of inviting Susanoo to dine with her one evening at the palace. He arrived on time. He was clean. He had on his best formal robes of sea blues and greens and greys. She led him into an inner chamber with the perfect flower arrangement in the corner. They sat either side of a low table. Food was brought. He ate with his mouth closed, which is quite an achievement. And there was some sake rice wine, nicely warmed. Most of you will know that sake is as strong as whiskey, but they both drank in moderation. And as soon as the meal was over, Amaterasu got up. She said, "Brother dear, it's been a delight to welcome you to the palace this evening. But as you know, I have to make an early start in the morning. So I must leave you now. I see you haven't quite finished your drink. Please do stay and finish your drink." And off Amaterasu went, trailing clouds of glory. The second that she'd gone, Susanoo Mikoto sent the servants to bring more sake. Lots more sake. He was knocking it back and necking it down and demanding more. And pretty soon he was roistering, rolling, ready, drunk for any trouble he could manage. He didn't bother sliding open the door. He just went straight through the paper wall, out into the corridor and through the palace. And he came to the front entrance. A few steps away, there was the grand staircase that led back down into the world. Susanoo Mikoto stepped out of the gate and onto the terrace there. And I don't know if this has happened to any of you. Yes, it might have happened to you. And some of you are a bit too clean living. What I'm talking about is that moment when you've had a skinful and it's late at night and you step outside and that cold night air rushes down into your stomach and curdles everything that is in there. And it is well, it's happened to me. It's a really bad, an uncomfortable moment. And that's what Susanoo Mikoto was going through when there came the pitter-patter clatter of tiny golden hooves and up trotted the pet Shetland pony with its little sparkly mane and tail and its snuffly pink nose. And it came up to Susanoo Mikoto and nudged him because it wanted a treat, and that was the wrong person. And that was the wrong moment to go nudging for a treat. In a drunken rage, Susanoo turned and seized the pony and picked it up and shook it till its little golden hooves rattled. And then he ripped its head off. In epic Japanese style, blood fountained everywhere. He threw the head down that way, the body down that way, and then Susanoo Mikoto collapsed in a drunken heap there at the top of the steps. And he lay there, snoring, farting, belching in his sleep all night. And some of you recognize this. You've slept next to one of those. And first thing next morning, out came Amaterasu, ready to to fly across the world. And she nearly went headlong over her brother's still sleeping form. She saw the dried blood splatters. She saw the head. She saw the body. She did not say another word. The sun goddess launched herself away from her palace, flying through the air, flying with her light streaming behind her until she came to the top of a great mountain, where there was the dark opening of a cave. The sun goddess hurled herself inside and with her magical powers lifted an enormous boulder and dropped it over the cave mouth, sealing herself in. And darkness and cold covered the world. Everything that breathed, everything that grew, was freezing and dying. And the ice sheets were spreading again. The 790-something gods and goddesses and lesser deities and some of the first few humans of that time, they swarmed to the mountaintop and they banged on the boulder. They begged their sun goddess to come back out, but all they got was her voice. No, I'm not coming out ever. Why should I come back out into a world where my own brother can do something so vile? And they were very worried. One of the humans came up with an idea. Bribery and corruption. They would offer presents to the sun goddess. So some of you gentlemen have had experience doing this. What do you offer a woman when you want to placate her, when you want to cheer her up because you've upset her? Anybody care to share your experience? Anybody?
Flowers and poetry.
Flowers and poetry would work for me, but Amaterasu said, I got all the flowers I could want in the world, and I don't care about poetry. I'd write my own haiku. Thank you very much. No. What else would you try?
Cadbury's milk tray.
I can't stand the stuff, but in any case, chocolate hadn't been invented yet. And ladies, women, what do you want? What cheers you up? Gentlemen, listen.
Jewelry.
Amaterasu said, I got all the gems in the world. I don't care. Anybody else? I mean, they tried really hard. They offered dresses, handbags, designer shoes, quite a lot of which hadn't been invented yet. None of it was working. And the cold was crushing them. They thought they were doomed. And then another little goddess arrived. Of course she was late. Azume is the goddess of mirth, the goddess of having a good time. Azume was probably getting over her own hangover. Azume bears a startling resemblance to me. She's short. She's physically not very fit. She's a bit wide for her height. Azume came puffing and panting and sweating up to the mountain and looked at everybody and said, what is going on here? It is freezing out there. What have you done? They explained. Azume said, you numpties, you made a right mess of this, haven't you? Right, you lot, naff off down the mountain and I will sort this out. So the 790 odd gods and goddesses and lesser deities and the humans naffed off down the mountain, and Azume got to work. First of all, she fetched a magical 8-sided mirror and hung it up in the branches of a tree around to the side of the cave entrance. Then she went down the mountain and she put on her most colourful makeup. She put on her brightest silks. She fetched one of those gigantic Japanese drums and put it on its side, jumped onto it and started her shimmy. She gave it everything, and she gave it that, and she gave it that, and she gave it some more. And she was a big girl, and she bounced, and she twirled, and she bounced, and there was a lot of her to bounce. She gave it the work. She was having so much fun, and people were cheering so loudly that bits of her were bouncing right out of her clothes. She revealed parts of herself you didn't know a goddess had. They loved it. They yelled for more, and all that applause floated up the mountain and squeezed around the boulder into the cave. Amaterasu heard it. Who's getting the applause? I am the sun goddess. It should be for me. Her curiosity became active. With a little nudge of magical power, she pushed the boulder aside just a little, and she looked out. The moment that her light shone out, the magical mirror caught it and made it swirl and dance and divided her light into all its rainbow colors. Amaterasu was captivated. She had to see where this was coming from. With a final flick of magical power, she pushed the boulder away and stepped out of the cave. And she saw her reflection in the mirror. It was the first time the sun goddess had ever seen herself. She had no time for mirrors in the palace. And no one had ever thought, no one had ever bothered to tell Amaterasu how exquisite she truly was. But when the sun goddess saw her reflection in that magical mirror, she felt better. She felt a lot better and went back down the mountain. This was what clever little Uzume had been waiting for. Uzume saw the goddess coming down, got off the performance space, and everyone who was there cheered and welcomed the sun goddess back to her place in the world. And so the world was saved. Susanoo Mikoto was banished to the deepest, darkest abyss of the ocean, where he has not stayed. You have all observed the effect he still has: earthquakes and volcanoes and storms and tsunami. But the humans learned from that time. They learned. We need to remember, when it's all going to hell in a handbasket, when the gloomy times are overwhelming us, when it feels like there's no hope, when we feel crushed, we don't give in. We don't give up. We gather our friends. We put on our glad rags. And together, all of us, we send back the cold and the dark. Together, we have ourselves a bloody good time. Thank you. Good night. Thank you. I've been Chloe of the Midnight Storytellers, and you've been a beautiful audience. Thank you. It's been fun.
Hey.